Hello, everyone, and welcome back to True Crime Wife by Jess. I'm your host, Jess Milliken. It's me. Welcome. On this podcast, if you're not familiar, we focus on female offenders and what caused them to offend. While many of the cases that we'll talk about involve violent crimes, we'll also cover less violent cases committed by women. Because understanding why is just as important as understanding what. And because we don't want to just talk about the gruesome cases that are already solved, I also want to bring awareness to the unsolved homicides and missing person cases, the ones that haunt us at night. So we also have episodes that are dedicated to those cases specifically, in the hopes that someday they will be solved and the families affected can have answers and justice can be served. If you are a family member or someone impacted by a case like that, please reach out to me at truecrimewifebyjess@gmail.com. I'd love to discuss the case and help bring awareness to it because anything could potentially help, and maybe that will help. That's what I want to do. I just want to help. Now, tonight's case, which will take, I posted on Facebook and I said it was only going to take 2 episodes, y'all. I spent all day today working on just part 1, and it's going to be three parts. So tonight is just part 1. And the reason for that is because I work full time. I work 60 hours a week sometime, like most of the time. I've been traveling a lot for work and I am absolutely exhausted, but I love doing this. So I put this together. It's going to be in 3 parts so that we can cover this case. And honestly, this case is arguably one of the most disturbing and horrifying stories that I've ever covered on True Crime Wife, which sounds way more nefarious than it should because this is only episode 7. But I'm going to stick with the drama here. I'm sticking to it. Behind the doors of an ordinary-looking home on Cromwell Street. I'm going to make it really dramatic. Hold on. Behind the doors of an ordinary-looking home on Cromwell Street lived a husband and wife whose crimes shocked the entire world. Mwah, ha, ha. But seriously, side note, yes, it's going to take me 3 episodes to cover this case, only because I don't have 3 hours to sit and do a podcast recording all at one time. I've been working crazy hours and it's been crazy. So bear with me. I love doing the true crime podcast, but I might have to limit how long the episodes are so that I can function, and not become the subject of of someone else's podcast. If you know, you know. Anyway, Fred and Rose West, they weren't just serial killers. Together, they created a house of unimaginable torture, abuse, and murder that went unnoticed for years. And they're the subject of our podcast episode tonight. And what makes this case even more chilling is how many times they could have been stopped, which I feel like this comes up a lot when we're talking about serial killers, especially. But it's chilling just how many times they could have been stopped and the number of lives that could have been saved. So over the next 3 episodes, we're diving deep into the twisted relationship between Fred and Rose, the victims whose voices deserve to be remembered, and the horrifying discoveries that turned a quiet neighborhood into one of the most infamous crime scenes in history. This is part 1 of the one with the bodies under the patio. We're going to focus on background stuff today, guys. We'll go way back in time to when Fred and Rose were children to see how they grew up. We'll talk about their relationship early on, how they met, their children, what life was like for their children growing up. And let me tell you, it's just as horrifying as their own childhoods were. So you're still going to get a lot of the true crime here. So today, we will briefly touch upon some of the murders that occurred, but the focus is on getting to know these 2 individuals because in order for us to really understand their crimes, we need to know who they were. And honestly, together, they formed Britain's most murderous couple. I feel pretty confident saying that. So let's take a step backwards in time into the darkness, brewing behind closed doors, and the terrifying escalation that would lead to what can arguably be called the most horrific crimes that the UK, and maybe even the world, has ever seen. So, lock your doors, grab your coffee, because it is 10 p.m. and I have to work tomorrow. And let's get into the case of Fred and Rose West. Before we get into the murders, the investigation, and the horrifying discoveries made at Cromwell Street, we need to talk about Fred and Rose themselves, because cases like this always leave people asking the same question. How does something this evil happen? Were they born monsters, or were they created over time? So we're going to start with Fred West, but quick disclaimer, because I forgot to say that at the beginning. This episode, we are going to be talking about, we talk about some pretty serious stuff. We talk about abuse, child abuse, neglect. We're going to be talking about sexual abuse specifically. There's a lot of it. So if that is something that you are sensitive to, I just want to give a pre-warning that we do talk about a lot of that stuff. And I just want to make sure that you guys are aware of that. There's not really any gore that we're going to be talking about, but that sexual abuse could be triggering for some people. So here we go. Fred West. What can we say about Fred? Well, first, he was born on September 29th, 1941 in Hertfordshire, England, into what many people describe as a deeply dysfunctional family. Go figure. Now, the West household, it was isolated, it was chaotic, and it was filled with disturbing behavior that neighbors and relatives would later describe as extremely inappropriate, which is honestly putting it lightly, and I find it weird. Like, when I read that, I was like, extremely inappropriate. It was beyond extremely inappropriate. I'm just saying. There were long-standing allegations of incest and abuse inside the family, allegations that have never fully been untangled because there are just so many stories, and so many of those stories have changed over the years. But what we do know for sure, Fred's parents were Walter Stephen West and Daisy Hannah Hill. The couple had 6 children, including Fred, but according to multiple sources, Fred was his mother's favorite. She was often overprotective of him, which was odd to those who knew them. The owner of the farm where the family lived, Kay Cotton, actually stated during an interview with The Independent that when discussing Fred West, Kay said, quote, "He was just an ordinary little lad, nothing that would stand out in your mind. He was small with a crop of curly hair and was very like his mother to look at," end quote. Basically, he wasn't much to look at. Nothing stood out. He was just an ordinary kid, but for whatever reason, Fred was the favorite. Now, when Fred was growing up, all of the children, including Fred, were expected to perform chores on the farm. The boys hunted rabbits and harvested wheat, and the girls did more domesticated chores. In school, Fred was in trouble a lot. He was distracted, he misbehaved, and he was not an A student by any stretch of the imagination. So it's really no surprise that at the age of 15, he quit school to become a full-time farm laborer. But he wasn't a fan of that, so he didn't stick with it for long. But without school and just working on the farm, he was kind of lacking in socialization. So the next year, when he was 16, he and one of his brothers, John, began attending a youth club in a nearby town, which was a great opportunity for socialization. There's lots of young people. It's a youth club, so they're all getting together, they're chatting, they're socializing. That was the whole point. However, Fred was very not good with the social skills. We'll put it that way. And he was known to harass women and girls and would even grope them in front of other people. Yes, that was a thing. He'd just kind of reach out there, hands out, reaching for things that he shouldn't have been reaching for. And honestly, when I was first looking into Fred's history, I was like, wow, I'm surprised no one ever clocked him. You know, right in the kissa, granny style, like on the Looney Tunes. Which, side note, if you don't know that reference, I'm sorry, and you're making me feel old. So, pretend that you know what I'm talking about. But I was not let down in the research, because at the age of 19, he did try to grope or touch or whatever a girl, and she gave him a good solid punch that sent him down a flight of stairs, causing a head injury. So, he got what he deserved in that case. I don't know who that girl was, but bravo. Whoever she is, wherever she is my hero. And we should all take a page out of her book. Someone tries to grope you, punch him. Not that I condone violence. Don't come for me. Now, The more we dig into Fred's past, we find out it wasn't just random girls and women that Fred was sexualizing and touching inappropriately. When he was in his late teens, in 1961, he was arrested for raping his 13-year-old sister, Kitty. And not only did he rape her, he also impregnated her. Yes, you heard that correctly, and yes, it's gross. Now, when Fred was arrested, he told police some pretty disturbing things, including that he was introduced to sex by his mother when he was 12 years old, although some sources suggest that he might have even been younger than that. And not only did his mother, Daisy, quote, take him to bed, but his father was also having sex with animals, according to Fred. So there's some bestiality going on in that house. There are multiple documentaries out there about Fred West that say that his father was having sex with animals and that he most likely encouraged Fred to do the same. It's clear that Fred's childhood was anything but conventional, and even more obvious when he was arrested for raping his sister and when he was speaking with the police. Because during those police interviews, Fred allegedly, cannot talk, y'all. Cannot talk. I've got coffee. It's 10:30 at night and I'm drinking coffee. So during the police interviews, when Fred was arrested for the rape of his sister, allegedly he stated to police that, yes, he molested young girls. He fully admitted that. But he followed it up with saying, quote, doesn't everybody do it? That to me, it's very clear that Fred didn't understand what was socially acceptable and what wasn't. And the ethics and base morals that should have been implanted in him by his family were lacking, to say the least. Now, whether he was actually sexually abused by his mother or pushed into bestiality by his father isn't 100% known. There are many sources out there that state that this is true, including documentaries and multiple articles. However, there are also articles out there that state that multiple family members claim that none of them were ever abused in any way by anybody, which is something that Fred's youngest brother, Doug, claimed in at least one interview. His siblings also do not appear to believe that there was anything going on with their mother and Fred or anything at all with animals. But again, most of the sources say that all of that stuff was happening. But then there were a couple that I found that were like, no, absolutely not. So I'm going to go with it was happening. But like I said, though, there are some documentaries out there that express that Fred's mother, Daisy, not only took him to bed, but that his father was having sex with animals and that he most likely encouraged Fred to do the same. It sounds like for most accounts that the childhood Fred had was anything but conventional. There was a lot going on, but I digress. Now, as far as the charges against him for raping his sister, Kitty refused to testify against him. And here, this part really kind of made me mad. His mother was prepared to testify in his defense. So the case ended up collapsing. Like, it went to trial, but he wasn't found guilty or anything like that. It just kind of went nowhere. And I just have to say that this is one of those times where if Kitty had testified against him and his mother hadn't been willing to testify on his behalf, and this had gone through the court system like it should have, and like it went the way that it should have gone, this could have been the point where this all stopped and we wouldn't be having a conversation right now. And I wouldn't be talking to a bunch of people who can't see me and I can't see you and it's just invisible. This wouldn't be happening right now. It just wouldn't. It also seems weird to me that his own mother was going to testify on his behalf when he was accused of and basically admitted to raping his own sister. Like, he admitted, yeah, I sexually abused girls. And yet his mom was going to defend him. It's just horrible. Like, I get wanting to protect your children, but this is the child who sexually abused his own sister. If you're going to choose sides, his might not have been the right side to select in this moment. And it honestly makes it look even more obvious that the claims that Fred made about he and his mother's relationship could have been true. Because why else would she have been getting ready to support him and be like, yeah, he didn't do it? Regardless of what else had happened to Fred prior to the situation with his sister, after the trial happened in November of 1961 and basically fell apart, Fred was banished from the family home and moved in with other family members. So there was that. Now, aside from all of the crazy things going on during his childhood and the one head injury that we already talked about, where he got beat up by a girl and lost, and I love it. I still love it. There was also another significant medical event that happened to Fred. At age 17, he was in a serious motorcycle accident and ended up in a coma for a week. So on top of poor upbringing, we now have a young man who has experienced 2 head traumas. That can't be good for brain development or anything. In another shocking set of events, though, a year after Fred had been arrested and put on trial for raping his sister, he got married. That's right, married. And no, not to his sister. If you're thinking sister, it wasn't his sister. He did not marry his sister. But he also didn't tell anyone before he got married, which kind of shows that he had a secretive side. Even for something like that, like you would think he would have said, hey, I'm getting married, but no, he kept it a secret. Apparently, Fred had met a woman named Catherine Costello, but she was commonly known as Rena. That's the name that she went by, was Rena. She was right around 18 years old when they met, and she was a few months pregnant with another man's child, but she was no longer with that man, and they weren't going to be having any sort of a relationship or anything like that. So on November 17th, 1962, Fred and Rena were married in Hertfordshire, and then they immediately relocated to Scotland, which isn't weird. Rena was actually originally from Scotland, and she and Fred, I believe, had met, or they most likely met while she was working as a waitress in the Milk Bar, which was a cafe in Ledbury, which was someplace that Fred spent a lot of time along with other young people in the area. So that's kind of where he met her. Now, Fred's brother, Doug, stated in an interview with one of the papers that, quote, we didn't know Fred was getting married until afterwards. He came back and said he had got married. He didn't tell the family. Only John knew about the wedding. He was the best man. When he came back and said that he had got married, we thought he was joking, end quote. Now, for those who are trying to keep up, Doug is one of Fred's brothers, and so is John. John is another one of Fred's brothers. And from what I can gather, it sounds almost like Fred and John were actually pretty close growing up. So on May 22nd, 1963, Rena gave birth to a daughter, Charmaine. So Charmaine is the daughter that is biologically hers because she just gave birth to her, but not biologically Fred's. This is from her previous relationship. And then not long after she gave birth to Charmaine, she ended up pregnant again. And this time Fred was the father, as far as we know. On July 6, 1964, Rena and Fred welcomed baby girl Anne Marie. Now, with all these babies being born and being newly married, you'd think things were going well for Fred West, right? Nope, wrong. In fact, he was having an affair during this time with a teenage girl, because he's got a thing for teens, Anna McFallThe. And we'll come back to her, so don't forget about her. Anna McFallThe, he was having an affair with her while he was married to Rena, so don't forget about her. We're going to talk about her. So by 1969, the marriage between Fred and Rena had essentially dissolved, and both children had spent some time in the custody of social services due to allegations of sexual abuse at the hands of Fred. Somehow, though, he and Rena had gotten custody back, but then Rena left them in November of 1969, and the children remained with Fred. And she didn't really have a lot of contact with him, but she was still around. Like, she still did reach out once in a while until 1971, when she completely disappeared. And yes, we're going to talk for a second about her disappearance. So it turns out that in 1971, Rena returned and made contact with Fred. She wanted to discuss custody of their children, probably because she wanted her children back because, Fred was probably abusing them. And she would actually be Fred's second victim. Yes, I know. We haven't talked about the first victim yet. We're not going to write the second. I'm going to make you guys wait a little bit. We're just going to talk about the second victim. So we're going to talk about Rena, his first wife. She was his second victim. She came in. She's like, I want to get custody of the kids, or I want more custody, or I'm not really sure how the conversation went. But what we know is that she disappears. And when she was finally found, she had been killed. She'd been strangled. So, and we know that Fred did it because he actually confesses to this later on. So, a year after he killed Rena, he would end up marrying Rose. So now we're going to talk about Rose, because honestly, if you think Fred's childhood is kind of effed up and a bit rough, you're about to be really impressed with Rose's upbringing, which is honestly way more disturbing in my opinion. And we're going to go into way more depth with Rose's childhood because, one, there's more information out there about it. We know more about it, and it's less of a, oh, did this actually happen? And more of a, yeah, this definitely happened. So anyway, this is your warning now. If you struggle with weird, incestuous relationships, child abuse, and sexual abuse, you might want to fast forward because her childhood had it all and then some. Rosemary Letts, who would later become Rose West, was born on November 29th, 1953, in Northam, Devon. And much like Fred, her childhood was filled with instability, abuse, and dysfunction. And it started for her even before she was born. She was actually the fifth of 7 children born to William Bill Letts and Daisy Gwendolyn Fuller. Yes, her mother's name is also Daisy. Fred's mom, Daisy. Rose's mom, also named Daisy. Now, her father, Bill, had been in the Navy and was away from home a lot, which left Daisy home to tend to their children. During her pregnancy with Rose, however, Daisy had a severe case of prenatal depression, which caused Bill to have to leave the Navy and return home so that he could kind of support his wife. And I say kind of support because the support that he gave her does not qualify really as support. So some things we need to know about Bill. He was very into the military lifestyle. He needed order. He craved having authority. And when he gave that up to be home, he lost all of it. But no worries, because we're going to see that he just went ahead and turned the household into his own military squad. I mean, to say he didn't adjust well to the civilian lifestyle is an understatement. He was strict, he was domineering, intimidating, and these are the words used to describe him by people who knew him, like neighbors and people who have been interviewed about the type of person that he was. Bill was also abusive, physically and sexually, to his own wife. According to a neighbor who grew up next to the Letts family, Jill Job, you could hear the screaming from their home because of just how severe the abuse was that he committed against his wife, Daisy. Daisy was constantly scared. According to Jill, her mother actually reported them to social services at one point, but nothing ever happened or came of it. So the longer that he was home, the more Daisy fell into an even deeper depression, which makes sense. And this was the depression that got so bad that she eventually needed therapy. And it wasn't the nice, like sitting on a couch, telling me your problems type of therapy. It was more severe. And remember, she's still pregnant. I mean, very pregnant with Rose, our future serial killer. So just before Rose was born, Daisy underwent electroconvulsive therapy, also known as ECT. If you're not aware, this is the type of therapy that involves electrodes that they attach to your skull, and then currents of electricity are sent through them, which causes the patient to undergo violent seizures. And the thought process back then was that this would help get rid of the depression and the mental illness. It's a pretty severe procedure, and it's capable of causing teeth to actually break from the force of the seizures. Also, I just hit the microphone. I'm hoping that didn't make noise. I've done it twice now, so if you hear like a random thud, that's just me talking with my hands. Now, first of all, this electroconvulsive therapy doesn't sound healthy even for someone who isn't pregnant. And then when you throw in a pregnant person, it sounds even worse. I can't imagine that this didn't affect Rose in the womb somehow. And, funny enough, a criminal psychologist, Dr. David Holmes, agrees with that statement. Or I agree with him because he's the professional and I'm just a random woman with a master's in criminal justice and a bachelor's in psychology that has a strange obsession with true crime. But I digress. According to Dr. David Holmes, the ECT that Daisy received definitely affected Rose's neurological development. the last course of ECT that Daisy received was literally the day before Rose was born. Like, she had that last treatment, and then Rose was born the next day. According to Dr. Holmes, quote, "In my view, it could very well be argued that Rose's neurological development will have been retarded," end quote. And not like, he's not saying retarded like stupid or something, but like retarded, like it prevented her development from occurring the way that it should have. Just clarifying that, because every time I read it, I'm like, that's a really weird choice word for him to use, but that's what he said. So he also stated that to have ECT so late in the gestative period is even more likely to have impacted Rose, because this is when like the more sophisticated parts of the brain develop. It's also when inhibitory parts of the brain are developed, like, you know, the parts that give us a conscience and empathy and the things that keep us from doing things that are evil and heinous and unethical and all the other adjectives that I could probably look up with a thesaurus. You know, it's the parts of the brain that make sure we do good things and that we don't become psychopathic killers. So the neighbor that I mentioned earlier, Jill, actually remembers the day that Daisy came home with Rose. Daisy's head was shaved from the ECT, and that was definitely, you know, something that sticks out to a young child. And then she's carrying this new baby. And Jill, during one of the interviews that I watched, I think, what was the name of that documentary? I know I mentioned it here soon, so you give me a few minutes and we'll talk about it. But she said that, you know, the baby was so cute and adorable, but definitely stuck out that Daisy's head was shaved right off. Now, after Rose was born, Bill and Daisy continued to have more children. But with each child and each day being stuck at home in domestic civilian life, Bill became even more domineering, more angry, and ultimately more abusive. If that's even possible, because he wasn't exactly a peach before that. So the family was described by outsiders as dysfunctional. People who knew the family, or at least saw them from afar, found them odd. They had all those children, but they were never outside playing. And in fact, the kids weren't even allowed to be outside playing, like ever. At first, I was like, well, maybe they were just paranoid that something would happen to them. Like, you know, they're being overly protective. But then the more I learned about Bill and then Daisy, it kind of became clear there was something more to this. So Daisy was living in a constant state of fear. People reported that she was always scared. She was jumpy. Her teeth would chatter because of how scared she was all the time. And this fear stemmed from Bill and the abuse that Daisy experienced at his hand. Bill wanted a clean house, and God forbid anything not be clean. So eventually Daisy kind of adopted this same obsession. And in order to ensure that the house stayed clean and the children stayed clean, everything stayed clean, the children couldn't play outside. There was actually one story about one of the children, and I can't remember if it was Rose or not, and I didn't write it down, so I'm going off memory here. But one of the children had a friend that was like, oh, come hang out with us. We're going to go do all this cool stuff with my family. And so she took off. Actually, I think it was Heather. I think it was the oldest biological daughter of both Rose and Fred. So Heather, I think it was Heather. That just kind of snapped for me. But anyway, the friend was like, come hang out with us. We're going to go do a bunch of stuff. And so she did. And they had the best day ever. But when she returned home, she was dirty. She was covered in mud. You know, she'd been playing. She was being a kid. And she was instantly in trouble. And she got a beating that was so bad that you could hear this girl's screams throughout the neighborhood. And so the mother of the other child told the kid, like, don't ask her to come play again or go with us anywhere. We don't want to add to what she's having to go through. You know, the whole neighborhood already basically knew, like, this guy's a jerk. These kids are constantly in trouble. And now we've just added to this because we thought we were giving this girl a fun time, and it had consequences. So this is the type of environment, though, that Rose was growing up in. It was a home where kids couldn't be kids, a home where the mother was terrified of her husband to the point that she beat the children if they did something out of line that would result in she herself getting beat. It was a vicious cycle, an environment where the neighbors knew there were things amiss, and some of them called social services, but nothing ever happened or came from it. So we know that Bill has some issues, but it didn't just come from him being a control freak and wanting to be in charge. Apparently, he had actually received a diagnosis as a teenager that he never told his wife or his family at all. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And as the years went by, he became more paranoid and his angry outbursts intensified. And he was unmedicated too, by the way, if that wasn't obvious yet. So we've got an unmedicated paranoid schizophrenic who is domineering. He's a control freak. He's a clean freak. He has terrified the crap out of his own wife to the point that now she is a clean freak and the kids can't play outside because if they do, they're going to get beat by their mother and or their father for making a mess. So there's a lot going on here. Oh, and I did want to mention that there was one more thing with the cleanliness thing that kind of stood out that I wanted to share. So according to what I read and like through researching, the cleanliness situation was such a big deal to Bill that it was actually reported that he made the children clean the carpets with toothbrushes. Now, I like to clean, especially carpets. I've got a thing with carpets. I like to vacuum. I like to shampoo them, but I've never ever considered cleaning them with a toothbrush. I don't think it would be worth it, and it would be a waste of time. But I am also that person that would rather just do it myself if it's that dirty. So anyway, this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but I like seeing the final outcome and being like, look what I did. Look how clean it is. I know I'm a weirdo. It's fine. But if you also like to wash or clean rugs, let me know so that I know I'm not the only weirdo out there. You know those videos of people washing really dirty rugs with hoses and shampoos and stuff that's like on Facebook Reels and TikTok videos? Yeah. Those videos are my guilty pleasure. I love them. It's a problem. But anyway, back to Rose. All of these things. So we've got the ECT that her mother underwent during the final stages of her pregnancy. We've got the domineering father, not being allowed to play outside or be a kid. It all greatly affected Rose's development from a young age. She would actually like rock back and forth, which is a coping mechanism that we see in children who are abused from a young age. I actually worked in child protection for a short stint, and it's something I've seen from working with those children who are abused, that moving back and forth, stimming behavior it kind of like helps soothe them or comfort them. So not only did Rose exhibit behaviors characteristic of abused children from very, very early on, she also grew up being disengaged and very passive, at least for a time, because we're going to see she's not passive forever. But it was this passive, disengaged nature that opened the door for her father, Bill, to take advantage. From a young age, he began grooming her. And by grooming, yes, I mean he would sexually abuse and molest her starting at a young age and continuing through her teen years. In a documentary that I watched a couple times about Rose's childhood, Rose West, Born Evil. I actually rented it on Prime Video. I think you can watch it free someplace else, but I don't have a subscription for whatever that platform was. So I got it on Prime Video. It's called Rose West, Born Evil. Bill is described as someone who had pedophilic tendencies. So we're going to be talking about gross stuff now. The grossness, it's coming. Rose's vulnerability and passivity made her someone who could be groomed, and that's what Bill did. The sexual abuse started early, and it continued, and it never really stopped. And that, along with everything else, 100% affected her development. The sexual abuse that Rose experienced actually molded her own sexuality as she grew into her teens. She actually became known as a bit of a nymphomaniac around town, like a sex addict, if you will. She was sexually active. She was popular with the men, especially the older men. She seemed to have an affinity for older men. And not to make it more gross, but she definitely has some daddy issues. Ew. She found it normal to be with older men because of the experiences that she'd had with her father. Not only that, but there are reports that when she was placed in charge of her younger brothers, like babysitting, watching over them, that she may have molested them as well and kind of continued that cycle of abuse. So, yeah. So by the time she was a teenager, Rose was sexually active, not only with her father, but with other men around town as well. She was also struggling in school. Just like Fred, she was never much of an avid student. No gold stars for her, just like we saw with Fred. She acted out. She developed a reputation for being unpredictable. She could go from 0 to 100 pretty damn fast. Teachers described her as being distracted and troubled, and classmates reported that she craved attention and affection, but then in the same instant, she had a volatile temper. So not someone that you wanted to mess with. So like I said, Rose wasn't getting any gold stars, and she ended up staying back in some of her grades, but it was when she started staying back and she was the oldest girl in the class, she was more developed than the other girls in the class, we kind of see her start to come out of that shell and become less passive. She wasn't the passive Rose that we had seen earlier on. She was more assertive. And I don't want to say she was a bully, but she was definitely bossy. And she wanted to be in charge, and she bossed the other kids around. She was a bossy Rosie. I almost said a bossy Rossi. But bossy Rosie, but she had found her voice. And then at just age 15, Rose met Fred West. So when she was 15, Fred was 28, almost 29 years old. This was in 1969. And Rose she was only 15. That's quite the age gap. They met at a bus stop, because isn't that where most almost 30-year-olds meet young teen girls that will eventually become their wives? No? Just them? That seems weird to me, guys. But seriously, like, he came up to her and started chatting with her at the bus stop, and then they get on the bus together, and he's like, "Oh, can I have a seat here?" And she's like, "Yeah, sure, I guess." And they sat next to each other, and they continued to chat. And they figured out, like, we've got a lot in common. So those commonalities included having mothers who were both named Daisy. They lived near each other, and eventually they discovered that they both had experienced incestuous relationships with their parents, for Fred with his mother and for Rose with Bill. Honestly, I have a feeling that Fred knew about Rose's reputation around town as well, with like the nymphomania stuff. And I feel like that was probably why he was so confident pursuing her, because that's what he does. He pursued her. He chatted her up, he sat with her on the bus, and he'd show up where she was working. And Rose, she didn't even like him initially. She wasn't into him at all. But she loved attention. She loved older men, and it didn't take long for her to fall for him. At one point, we find out in the documentary, that one I mentioned before, so Rose West, Born Evil, that Fred would bring up S&M. And this didn't turn Rose off like it would have many other women at the time. She was good with it, which does seem a little strange for a 15-year-old. But then again, at this point, she had a lot of experience. Granted, it was with her father, of all people. It's so gross. It's so gross. But she had an appetite for things. And I'm not sure if Fred just knew somehow that this girl was into this stuff, or if he was just hoping. But despite everything Rose had experienced at home, she was totally on board with it all. Then again, I'm also not sure exactly when the S&M conversation became a known thing between the two of them, like when they talked about it, but either way, she was not running away from that. So even though Rose was only 15 when she met Fred, by the time she was 16, they would be living together. She moved in under the guise of being the nanny for his 2 children. Fred was technically still married, but was estranged from Rena, and he had both of their children in his custody. So Charmaine and Anne-Marie. Now, this part was like, I was kind of surprised here. So Rose's parents weren't immediately on board with this relationship. Fred was 29, Rose was 15. That's a big age gap, and a bit pedophilia-ish. It doesn't look great. Which, honestly, if this was part of the issue Bill had with the relationship, that's the pot calling the kettle black, if you ask me, because We want to talk about pedophilia here. Bill is like the poster man for it. But Rose does move in with Fred a year later to his home at 25 Midland Road. And again, supposedly she moved in to be the nanny. Anne Marie and Charmaine were both living there, so she moved out of her father's home, stepped into Fred West's home, and had to take care of those two kids. And of course, not long after she moved in with Fred, she got pregnant. And they had their first daughter, Heather. But shortly after Heather's born, something happens. Fred gets arrested. That's right, he got arrested. And no, it wasn't for anything weird or sex related. He actually had a bit of a theft issue. He liked to steal things. So he was arrested and went to jail for theft. This left Rose home alone with 3 children to take care of, and she's only 17 years old. And that, to me, that's a lot for a 17-year-old. So now I want to talk more about Fred's jail time and what happened while he was in jail. But first, let's finish up Rose's childhood, because technically she's still under 18 at this point. So she's still a kid, even if she's married and has a child. So let's just finish up this little bit here. So I mentioned that from a young age, she was being sexually abused by her father, and that it continued into her teen years. But I don't think I told you that as an adult, when she finally marries Fred, she's still having sexual relations with her father. Did I mention that? If I didn't, or even now that I did, do you believe me? Because it sounds pretty unbelievable and ridiculously gross. Anyone else just go, what the fuck? Was that just me? Okay, because honestly, I wasn't expecting that little piece of information when I was looking at this case. Absolutely disgusting. I actually learned about this when watching that documentary that I've mentioned a couple times already. My husband was in the other room, so he was kind of listening but wasn't watching it. And when he heard that, I hear him from the other room. He's like, what the fuck did they just say? And I'm like, yeah, they did just say that. You heard correctly. It was that shocking. And Fred was aware of this. He knew about Rose and Bill still doing stuff, and he was okay with it. Like, what is going on? I can't. As a side note, before we move on from childhood stuff, Fred and Rose finally did get married on January 29th, 1972. It was after Rose turned 18 and Fred was out of jail. So he wasn't in jail for very long. Now, with childhoods like the ones that we've described, we get an understanding of the type of morals and values, or lack thereof, that Rose and Fred West had. And of course, these two very depraved individuals happened to meet, get married, and have children. And honestly, it wasn't long after they had their first baby that things would get murderous. Not really sure which word I like more, but there was murder. So now we're going to move on from their childhood to their life together, from moving in together to getting married and having children and all the crazy crap that happened in between. So we already know that Fred had 2 children before he and Rose got together. One biological daughter and one daughter who wasn't his biologically, but he raised her as his own. Those 2 kiddos were Charmaine, born in 1963, and then Anne Marie, born in 1964. Rose entered their lives when Charmaine was 6 and Anne Marie was 5. Between 1970 and 1983, Fred and Rose had a lot more children together. They had 8. 8 children. That's a lot of kids. So let's just go through these kids really quick. So Heather was their oldest biological between the 2 of them. She was born on October 17th, 1970. We've got May, who was born on June 1st, 1971. Stephen, their first son, was born in 1973. Tara was born in either 1973 or 1974. Exact year kind of varies by sources. We've got Louise, who was born in 1975. Barry, who was born in 1980. And then Rosemary Jr., who was named after her mother, was born in 1982. And then finally, Luciana, who was born in 1983. Now, during the course of their marriage, Rose wasn't just having sex with Fred. No, no, no. Because, having a twice your age husband and then also having relationships with your father, that wasn't enough for her. She had a bit of a sex addiction. So she was also working as a sex worker. And Fred liked to watch. So they had a peephole where he could kind of see what was going on in the bedroom because they did this out of their house. And there were recording devices so that he could hear what was going on. He wanted to hear it. He wanted to see it. He had a very voyeuristic thing going on. But because of this extracurricular activity that they both enjoyed, some of the children may not actually be Fred's biologically. However, this is one thing that I can give credit to Fred for to a certain point, I guess. He did treat each and every child like they were his own. They weren't like, oh, you're not even my kid, you're a bastard, nothing like that. He treated them all like they were his, but granted, being treated like his actual child really didn't mean anything because we'll find out. You'll see. But, so there were actually some sources that suggested that Barry was born in 1980. There are some theories out there that he was actually biologically Bill's child. And unfortunately, Barry died from an overdose at the age of 40, but not before he had given some details about his childhood and what it was like growing up in the home of Fred and Rose West. And let me just say that from reading the interviews that he has given, none of it was good. Not a good time in the West household. So first of all, first things first here, Fred is a pedophile. I'm not going to sugarcoat that at all. We pretty much know that already because at almost 30 years old, he started a relationship with a 15-year-old and then married her. But he didn't just stop with the pedophilia when he got himself a young teen wife because Fred sexually abused his own daughters. Like I said, this episode is just chock full of sexual abuse and it's horrible. When I mentioned I did child protection, my caseload involved very heavily at times. It seemed like I was constantly being given the cases where the children had been sexually abused. And those are the worst, some of the worst cases sometimes I feel like. But anyway, we know that Fred, for a fact, sexually abused Anne Marie, Heather, May, and Louise. And the abuse was repeated and it was ongoing over multiple years. And then in addition to sexually abusing the girls, there was neglect, physical abuse, verbal abuse, fear-mongering, all of the things that you can think of being involved in a dysfunctional, awful home for children were present in this home. There was no breaking the cycle of abuse that Fred and Rose had experienced in their own homes. It just continued into their households. So let's talk about Anne Marie West. So Fred's daughter from his first marriage. This Anne Marie was the biological daughter of him and Rena. And she was repeatedly assaulted by both Fred and Rose and was actually allegedly forced into prostitution as a young teenager. According to later reports, Rose sometimes participated directly in the sexual abuse, including restraining Anne Marie while Fred assaulted her. First example that we have is the first incident, supposedly, was 1972 when Anna Marie was only 8 years old. She was only 8. We know she was restrained and raped by Fred while Rose watched and actively encouraged the abuse. And reportedly, Rose forcibly undressed her daughter. That was the first assault. 8 years old, guys. And then after it was over, Rose allegedly told Anne Marie, I'm sorry, everybody does it to every girl. It's a father's job. Don't worry. Don't say anything to anybody. What? That's not a thing. And I feel so bad for these kids. And it's a lot. Hopefully you guys can see why I have to do this in 3 different parts. This is a lot to dive into. So this sexual abuse continued for years, and Rose facilitated Fred's abuse of Anne Marie, tying her to furniture to encourage Fred to rape her. And it just goes on and on. I'm not going to go into all the details because once you hear it, you can't unhear it, and I wish I didn't know it. It was pretty horrible what these supposed parents did to their children, and Anne Marie was absolutely traumatized. And yeah, there's a lot more. If you're really that interested in knowing all of the things that happened to Anne Marie, Google it because it's pretty horrific. Now, when Anne Marie was 13, she was even forced into prostitution, and she was told to tell the clients that she was 16. She actually ran away from home in 1979 when she was just 15 years old. So she's run away. So now we know about the sexual abuse of Anne Marie because in 1992 she told the police, but she never testified in court to any of the abuse in fear of her stepmother. So the case didn't go anywhere. And then in 1995, when Rose was on trial for murder, Anne Marie was called to testify. And at that point, she did testify. She's actually the only kid who testified against Rose during the trial for the murders. She testified and told the court that Rose was worse than Fred in all respects. She was more calculating, aggressive, and controlling. That's pretty powerful stuff. Yeah. I feel so bad for these children. We've only really talked about Anne Marie, but these kids, they went through it. They went through it, and the trauma that they experienced didn't just go away when Fred and Rose were arrested. I mean, first of all, like I said, Anne Marie was the only child who testified in the murder trial, just as like a side note, because we'll talk about the trial in the last episode. But since the trial, she's actually attempted suicide twice. And her first attempt was 2 weeks after testifying against Rose. And that's just heartbreaking. She's really been put through the ringer. So one more thing about Anne Marie, and then I'm going to move on to the rest of the children. But Fred's brother, John, was also actually charged with raping Anna Marie at one point. But he took his own life before the verdict was delivered. So there's that. Yeah. So anyway, as of the last thing that I could find, Anne Marie is somewhere around the 61-ish, 62-ish, something in their age range. She's married, she's got children, and it looks like she's doing well, despite the hard childhood that she had. So that's good. So remember, I mentioned Anne Marie actually ran away in 1979. So when she ran away, Heather and her younger sister May became the focus of Fred's sexual abuse. Allegedly, he said at one point to them, quote, "I made you. I can do what I like with you," end quote. He also allegedly told them that he wanted to impregnate them, and he forced them to watch porn with him. Yeah. This guy's gross. So in an attempt to prevent Fred's abuse, Heather and May would actually try to avoid allowing each other to be alone with him. They wouldn't shower when he was around or get undressed when he was even in the house. According to one article I found, May actually wrote later on that Heather was affected quite badly by all of this, even more than she was. According to May, Heather started biting her nails until they bled. She had nightmares. She rocked back and forth whenever she sat down, and she was always looking to see where her father was, trying to keep an eye on him. Which brings me to so Heather. Let's talk about Heather. Heather was very deeply affected by all of this. And it makes sense. So it really wasn't a surprise then when she left school in June of 1987. Except she didn't just leave school, she completely disappeared. Nobody ever saw her again after June of 1987. Her siblings were told by their parents that Heather had left to accept a job someplace, but then they changed the story to, Heather had run off with a lesbian lover. And they even went so far as to say that she was involved in credit card fraud. However, and honestly, the disappearance of Heather was probably the undoing of the West killers, especially when it became a joke in the house. Well, it was a joke that Fred would make, that if the kids ever misbehaved, they'd end up under the patio, like Heather. So yeah, that's some foreshadowing there. Now, May was really close with Heather. They both worked together to try to avoid being alone with Fred, to avoid the sexual abuse, but May also suffered physical abuse at the hands of their mother. Rose once allegedly dragged a knife across May's ribcage and left light wounds all over her. And of course, we know about the sexual abuse. So May actually denied being sexually abused for years. It wasn't until 2018 when she wrote a memoir, which is entitled Love as Always, Mom XXX, The True and Terrible Story of Surviving a Child with Fred and Rose West. Or not a child, a childhood with Fred and Rose West. And it was in this memoir where she wrote about the abuse. Today, May is alive and well and living somewhere in the UK. And last I could find, she was a mother of 2. So the next kiddo in this household was Stephen. He was the firstborn boy in 1973, and he was not sexually abused that I could find any evidence of anyway. He did experience physical abuse, though, including being hit over the head with a bowl at one point, and he was repeatedly kicked in the head and chest by Rose. At one point, Fred did tell Stephen that when he turned 17, he had to have sex with his mother, because is that not a thing that all 17-year-old boys have to do? It's so gross. Guys, it's so gross. But he ended up being just kicked out at the age of 16, so he didn't have to worry about that. But he did a really good job of trying to protect his sisters. He would try to stay in the room with May and Heather to make sure that they weren't left alone with him, and kind of like work with them to try to prevent their father from abusing them. Okay, so we've got Stephen. We talked about Stephen. So May, let's talk about May again, because she tried to kill herself. We talked about that. And then in 2002, now this is what we were going to go to. So May tried to kill herself. We talked about that. And then in 2002, Stephen also attempted to kill himself. And that's hard. Even years later, it's still sad. And I feel so bad for them. From what I was able to find, Stephen is now married. He's got 2 children, and he still lives in the Gloucester area. So that's good. From what I could find, the other 5 West children were taken into social services custody at one point or another, and most of them are all living under new names and are alive and well, though it's unclear what forms of abuse and neglect they experienced before being taken into state custody. We can assume that it was just as extensive as what the other children experienced. Okay, so I talked about the oldest children of Fred and Rose, but did you notice we didn't talk about Charmaine? So let's talk about her. Remember, Charmaine is Fred's oldest daughter, not his biological daughter, but he always referred to her as his daughter. It was actually Rena's daughter that she was pregnant with when she and Fred got together. So when Rose moved in to be the nanny and then got pregnant with Heather, we talked about how Fred went to jail soon after Heather was born. This left Rose home alone with Heather, who was a newborn baby, Anne Marie. And then we've got Charmaine. So Charmaine was the oldest, and she didn't like Rose. She was defiant. She didn't listen to her. And when Rose tried to discipline her, Charmaine fought back. She was spirited. If she got disciplined, she acted like it didn't bother her at all, which really infuriated Rose. So when Fred went to jail, there were letters and phone calls between them, and Rose complained about Charmaine not listening to her, and oh my God, I can't handle this, and why do I have to deal with her? And of course, you'd leave me here with her by myself, and it just went on and on and on. She's just complaining. Rose would beat Charmaine. I mean, she'd make her stand on chairs naked as punishment. Nothing got to this little girl. Like, I have to hand it to her. She was a strong little girl, and she never cried, which made Rose even madder because she wanted this girl to obey her, and she wanted to be able to get to her. She needed some sort of sign that she was in charge and that this 6-year-old girl was not in charge. Well, one day things escalated enough that Rose killed Charmaine. We don't know for sure how it happened or the details of that day, but we do know that after she died, Rose put her body in the cellar, and that's where she stayed until Fred was released from prison. It was then that Fred had to dispose of his daughter's body. To me, this was like a smack in the face to Fred, and why I really do feel like Rose was the one behind a lot of these murders. Like, it was definitely a combined effort between the two of them, but she was definitely the one in charge in this relationship, because it was kind of like leaving Charmaine's body down there and waiting for Fred to get out of prison so he'd have to deal with it. It was kind of like a, how dare you leave me to take care of all these kids? This is your punishment. That's kind of what it seemed like to me anyway. But yeah. And I remember, they're not even married at this point. So like, he's been in jail. He's just gotten out. They're not married. But it was at this point that Fred is going to make a confession to Rose. He's going to tell Rose about something that he did. He tells Rose, do you remember when I mentioned a little bit ago about Anna McFallThe? You know, the woman, or 18-year-old that Fred was having a affair with when he was with Rena. Well, he tells Rose he killed her. He killed 18-year-old Anna McFall. And if you remember when we were talking about his marital issues with Rena, and they were having that affair, well, it turns out Anna had gotten pregnant by him, and so he killed her, strangled her, and left her for dead. So now Fred and Rose, they've got a little shared bond, a little murder bond going on. It's a strong one. And that bond would never really waver, especially as long as Rose was able to have her sexual appetites met. The West household was very sexualized. We've already talked about how Rose was a sex worker. She was a sex worker through and through. She made some of her daughters participate too when they reached certain ages. And Fred was aware of this and encouraged it. And he was a participant in the sex work. Like we've talked about, he was a peepster, little voyeurism going on there. So this was a household of sex, abuse. We've got physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. And it was filled with neglect. And there were at least 2 children killed at the hands of one or both parents. And at least one person killed by Fred before he had even met Rose. And like we mentioned earlier in this episode, I almost forgot because there's just so much to unravel here, Fred also killed Rena. So that's 4 bodies right now, and we've only scratched the surface. Honestly, you couldn't pay me enough money to have lived in this household. Not even for a day. Like, talk about a dysfunctional home. And I do want to mention really quick here that they had all of this, we've talked about all the crazy stuff, but to the outside, it wasn't quite like when Rose and Fred were growing up. Like, people didn't look at this home filled with all of these kids and stuff and immediately think dysfunction. They did normal stuff together. They went bike riding, they went on picnics, they did Christmas, they did birthdays. Like, they did a pretty decent, okay-ish job of faking it and making it seem like, they were normal, even though they weren't. So there's that. I just wanted to kind of throw that in there. And honestly, I hate to end the story time here because this is such an interesting case. But we could be here for another 2 hours talking about this case and never be done, which is why I'm doing it in 3 parts. So for now, I'm going to call it quits because it is now almost 11:30 at night and I still have to edit this to get this out to you guys because I want you guys to have the episode since I didn't do one last weekend because I was working. Anyway, we've talked about Fred and Rose West's childhoods. Yeah. Wow, guys. Wow. This is what happens when Jess is up late. I like true crime and I like horror, but I'm like let's just like watch it or listen to it like at 7 p.m. because I'm tired. So we've talked about Fred and Rose West's childhoods. We've discussed their relationship. We've talked about how they met. We've talked about their children. And we even got into some murder here. So like I said, we're ending this episode with a 4-person body count already. And we've barely, and I mean barely, scratched the surface of the crimes that these 2 committed. Thank you so much for listening to part 1 of this episode, the one with the bodies under the patio, the story of Fred and Rose West. I know there was less murder in this episode, but honestly, I think we touched upon enough criminal happenings for one night. So part 2 will be released later this week, so stay tuned for that. I'll keep everyone updated on my Facebook page, The True Crime Wife by Jess. In part 2, we'll discuss the rest of the murders and the timeline of events surrounding them. And there's a lot involved with that too, because I want to make sure when we're talking about these murders that we're going to be talking about in part 2, that we really discuss these victims and properly remember them, because what happened to them is just, it's horrible. In part 2, we'll talk about the rest of the murders and then the timeline stuff. And then when we do part 3, which will either be released later this week or early next week. Again, I'll update everyone on my Facebook page. It just depends on my work schedule, because we've got a lot going on at work. So part 3 will be a review of the investigation, the trial, and a more in-depth look into some psychology stuff of Rose West. And then finally, we're going to talk about where Rose West is today, how prison is treating her, because I'm sure we're all curious. So, part 3 will be out at some point, probably next week, but I'm going to try to aim for the end of this week. And finally, I hope you guys all enjoyed this episode. If you do want more information about this case, check out my Facebook page, check out the show notes, and I'll be posting some additional information and content on the Facebook page about this episode. Facebook page is The True Crime Wife by Jess. You can also follow me there for podcast updates and additional content. Again, if you have a case that you want to see covered, please email me at truecrimewifebyjess@gmail.com. And as always, remember that every crime has a breaking point, and every woman has a line she never thought she'd cross. Until she does. I'll see you in the next episode.